The room didn't react immediately. For a brief moment, it felt like nothing had happened at all. No raised voices, no visible confrontation. Just a quiet interruption, measured, deliberate, and placed with precision. And yet, every person in that chamber understood something had shifted. Because when Clarence Thomas decided to speak, it wasn't routine. It wasn't procedural. It was intentional. And the timing of it changed everything. The hearing had been moving at a steady, predictable pace. Arguments were being presented, positions carefully laid out, each side following the expected rhythm of a formal proceeding. There was structure, order, and a sense that everyone understood their role within it. At the center of it sat Jasmine Crockett, composed and prepared, delivering her position with the kind of clarity that comes from repetition and discipline. Nothing about her tone suggested uncertainty. Nothing about her posture invited interruption. But then it came. Not loud, not aggressive, just a voice entering at precisely the moment it wasn't expected. Clarence Thomas leaned forward slightly, his presence alone enough to redirect attention. He wasn't known for frequent interjections. In fact, his silence over the years had become part of his identity on the bench. When he spoke, people noticed not because of volume, but because of rarity. And now, he was speaking directly into her argument. There was no confusion about what it meant. It wasn't a question asked for clarification. It was a challenge framed as inquiry, a shift in control, delivered without raising a single decibel. The room stilled. It wasn't just the interruption. It was when it happened mid-thought, mid-flow, at the exact point, where momentum had begun to build in her favor. And for a brief second, all eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett, not to see if she would respond, but to see how, because moments like this don't unfold in words. They unfold in timing. She didn't answer immediately. There was a pause, small enough to go unnoticed by anyone not paying attention, but long enough to matter. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't push back. She didn't attempt to reclaim the floor. She let the interruption sit. And that choice began to change the dynamic. Around the room, subtle shifts took place. Observers leaned in slightly. Notes stopped mid-sentence. The rhythm that had defined the hearing up to that point no longer applied. Something quieter, more deliberate, had taken its place. Thomas's question remained in the air, structured carefully, aimed precisely. It questioned consistency. It suggested contradiction. It carried the weight of authority without needing to emphasize it. And still, Crockett didn't respond right away. Because what she understood, what many in the room were beginning to realize, was that responding too quickly would mean accepting the terms of the interruption. And she wasn't going to do that. When she finally spoke, her tone didn't rise to meet the challenge. It moved past it, calm, measured, controlled. She didn't begin by defending herself. She didn't address the implication directly. Instead, she reframed the structure of the question itself, subtly, almost quietly, but with precision. It was a shift so small it could have been missed. But it changed the direction of the exchange. Because now, the conversation wasn't about whether she could answer the question. It was about whether the question itself had been framed correctly. And that's when the balance started to move. Thomas followed up. Not aggressively, but deliberately. A second entry, this time narrower, more focused. If the first interruption had tested her position, the second one tested her consistency under pressure. Again, the room waited. Again, Crockett didn't rush. She responded with structure, layering her answer in a way that didn't just address the surface of the question, but the foundation beneath it. References came not as defenses, but as clarifications. Language tightened, arguments aligned. There was no visible resistance. But there was no concession either. And somewhere in that exchange, something subtle began to take hold. The conversation wasn't moving forward anymore. It was turning. What had started as an interruption was no longer controlling the pace. The rhythm now belonged to whoever could maintain clarity under pressure. And Crockett wasn't losing it. Thomas's posture shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to signal recalibration. The tone of the follow-up questions adjusted, not softer, not harder, just different, more precise, less assumptive, because the initial approach hadn't produced the expected result. And that mattered. Across the room, attention sharpened. This was no longer a routine exchange. The structure of authority was still in place, but the interaction within it had changed. Crockett continued, her voice steady, her pace controlled. She didn't expand unnecessarily. She didn't over-explain. Every sentence served a purpose. Every reference connected back to the central framework she had established. And she never once raised her tone. That restraint did more than any rebuttal could have. Because in a setting where authority is often reinforced through interruption, maintaining composure becomes its own form of control. Thomas pressed once more, a narrower angle this time, focused on a specific detail, the kind of question designed not to challenge broadly, but to find a point of weakness within the structure she had built. And for the first time, there was a noticeable shift in the room's energy. Not tension, anticipation, because now the moment wasn't about interruption anymore. It was about resolution. Crockett paused again, but this time the pause felt different. Not reactive, not strategic, final. When she spoke, it wasn't longer than her previous responses. It wasn't louder. It wasn't framed as a counter-argument. It was a single, precise clarification, delivered without emphasis, grounded in structure, and complete. There was no immediate response. No follow-up interruption, no redirection. Just silence. Not the kind of silence that signals confusion, the kind that signals recognition. Because in that moment, the exchange had reached its conclusion not through escalation, but through clarity. Thomas didn't speak again right away. He didn't need to. The line of questioning had ended where it needed to, not because it was shut down, but because it had been answered in a way that left no immediate path forward. And that was the shift. The hearing continued. Arguments resumed. Structure returned. The formal rhythm of the proceeding reestablished itself as if nothing unusual had taken place. But the tone was different, subtly, but unmistakably. Crockett's presence in the room had changed, not in volume, not in visibility, but in perception. She was no longer just participating in the process. She was shaping it. And everyone in that room had seen it happen. Not through confrontation, not through dominance, but through restraint. Outside the chamber, the moment began to take on a life of its own. Observers who had watched it unfold in real time struggled to describe it not because it was unclear, but because it hadn't followed the pattern they expected. There was no defining outburst, no single line designed to go viral, no visible clash. And yet, the shift was undeniable. Clips circulated, transcripts were reviewed. Analysts pointed to different parts of the exchange, each identifying a slightly different moment where they believed control had changed hands. But none of them disagreed on the outcome. Something had happened, and it hadn't been loud. Back inside, the hearing moved toward its conclusion. Formalities were observed, final statements delivered. The structure held, as it always does. But the earlier moment remained, unspoken, unaddressed, and fully understood, because in environments built on authority, the most significant changes rarely come from force. They come from timing, from knowing when not to speak, from recognizing that not every interruption requires an immediate answer, and from understanding that control, once shifted, doesn't need to be announced. It only needs to be maintained. There was no closing remark that acknowledged it, no summary that captured it in full, just the continuation of process, and the quiet awareness that, for a brief moment, the balance had moved. No raised voices, no spectacle, just a measured interruption, and a response that didn't meet it at the same level. It moved past it, and in doing so, changed the room. The structure of the hearing settled back into place, as if the interruption had never happened. On the surface, Everything still followed the same order. Statements were being delivered, arguments were being recorded. The formal rhythm of the room, built on procedure and control, continued without visible disruption. But beneath that structure, something had already shifted. Because moments like that don't disappear once they pass. They stay, quietly, influencing everything that comes after. At the center of it, Jasmine Crockett remained composed. There was no visible reaction carried forward from the interruption, no adjustment in tone, no change in posture. If anything, she seemed more deliberate now. Every word placed carefully, every sentence measured, not slower, but more controlled. It was the kind of composure that doesn't draw attention to itself, but holds it anyway. Across from her, Clarence Thomas returned to stillness. That, in itself, might have seemed unremarkable to an outside observer. Silence had long been associated with his presence during proceedings. Years of restraint had defined his public image on the bench. But within the room, that silence carried a different weight now, because it wasn't the same silence as before. It followed an interruption, and that changed how it was understood. The hearing moved forward. Legal points continued to be outlined. References to constitutional structure, precedent, and federal authority were introduced and expanded upon. Everything, at least outwardly, remained within expectation, but attention had narrowed, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Observers weren't just listening anymore. They were waiting to see if that interruption had been a single moment or the beginning of something else. Crockett continued speaking, her tone steady, her pacing controlled. There was no attempt to accelerate through her argument, no effort to regain lost ground, because she hadn't lost it. She was building something instead, quietly, line by line. Each point connected to the next, with intention. No unnecessary expansion, no emotional framing, just structure. And that structure began to matter more than anything that had come before. Because in a setting defined by authority, consistency becomes a signal. It tells the room whether pressure has had an effect. And in this case, it hadn't. Thomas remained still, but attentive, not disengaged, not passive, listening. And that distinction was important. Because when someone known for silence chooses to speak once, it raises a question. Will they speak again? The room didn't know the answer yet, but the possibility of it changed the way everything was being received. Crockett reached a transition point in her argument, a natural shift moving from one framework to another. The kind of moment where attention can drift if nothing interrupts it. But here, attention didn't drift. It held. Because the earlier interruption had created something new, uncertainty. Not about the argument itself, but about what might happen next. And that uncertainty kept the room engaged. No one moved unnecessarily. No one spoke out of turn. Even the smallest sounds, the turning of a page, the adjustment of a pen, felt more noticeable against the controlled silence. It wasn't tension in the traditional sense. It was awareness, heightened, focused, and building. Crockett continued, her delivery unchanged. If the interruption had affected her, it wasn't visible in her execution. There was no attempt to compensate, no overcorrection, just continuation, but not passive continuation. Intentionnel, directed, as if she understood that the moment wasn't behind her. It was still unfolding, and somewhere within that unfolding, another shift was coming. The only question was when. The rhythm of the room shifted again slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for those paying attention to feel it. A clerk's soft clearing of the throat, a slight adjustment in the seating of a judge, the subtle repositioning of a legal pad. Each motion was minor, yet collectively they signaled an awareness of something in motion. Clarence Thomas had not spoken, yet the room acknowledged his presence differently now. It was the kind of presence that bends the energy of a space without a single word. Even the most experienced aides and clerks shifted, conscious of how that weight could influence the proceeding. Crockett continued, her argument carefully constructed, but the undercurrent of authority was beginning to press. Points that had felt clear and linear now carried an added scrutiny. Every reference, every historical citation, every procedural assertion was being measured not just for accuracy, but for potential interpretation by those with ultimate decision-making power. The micro-hooks subtly intensified. A pause here, a deliberate emphasis there. Lines like, "This precedent exists precisely for these circumstances," were delivered with calm certainty, yet implied the consequences if ignored. Observers in the gallery, who had been relaxed moments before, straightened in their seats. Even journalists taking notes adjusted their posture, sensing that the room's focus had narrowed to a critical edge. Crockett's composure remained intact, but she began weaving in slightly more granular context. Details that would normally be absorbed subconsciously were now highlighted. Not for the sake of drama, but to guide attention, to anchor the room in the rationale behind her argument. The authority in the room did not need to speak to exert pressure. Its silence sufficed. But subtle signals, eye contact, measured nods, the way a hand rested on the bench created an invisible current. Crockett was navigating it, threading her points between invisible lines of expectation. At one point, she referenced a procedural nuance, the kind that could be overlooked if one wasn't paying full attention. The micro-hook here was precise. It hinted at potential consequences without stating them explicitly. A seasoned observer would notice. An unprepared participant might miss it entirely. The tension, though still quiet, had grown. It was no longer about whether the interruption had happened. Now, it was about what the room could tolerate, how authority could shape perception, and how well she could maintain control under scrutiny. And yet, she did. With each sentence, she reasserted her presence, her command of the material, and her ability to operate under the pressure of both visible and invisible forces. It wasn't confrontation yet, not overtly, but the shift had begun. The subtle pressure of authority, the expectation of compliance, the weight of institutional power. It was all converging. Observers leaned in, consciously or not. Every pause, every carefully placed term, every controlled inflection was now under a magnifying glass. Crockett's final point in this section was concise, deliberate, precise, and commanding. No flourish, no emotion. Just the clarity of her argument, sharpened by the room's unspoken scrutiny. The effect was unmistakable. Silence, focus, anticipation. The stage was set for the next phase. The subtle pressure of authority had been established, and the real challenge, maintaining control while under its weight, was about to escalate. The room, once uniformly attentive, now showed signs of division subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough for someone attuned to notice. A shift in posture here, a slight furrow of the brow there. Crockett had navigated the authority's presence with precision, yet the first subtle challenge was inevitable. It came not as a confrontation, but as a carefully measured interruption. A question, calmly phrased, delivered with the weight of procedural curiosity rather than overt dissent. "Could you clarify how this precedent applies under these circumstances?" The micro-hook here was evident. It was not an attack. It was a prompt that tested depth, demanded specificity, and hinted at potential gaps, all without being confrontational. The phrasing alone carried enough tension to require careful response. Crockett paused, not because she was unprepared, but because the pause itself reinforced control. In the silence, the room leaned in. Journalists adjusted their pens, observers straightened, and even the authority figures exchanged subtle glances. Then she responded, clear, concise, anchored in context. She layered her explanation with examples and historical references that both answered the question and reinforced her command over the subject matter. Micro-hooks were threaded through her sentences, small, compelling cues that drew attention to the strength of her reasoning. The challenger, satisfied with her response, or at least neutralized for the moment, leaned back, yet the tension lingered. The room had felt the push, and it had been absorbed. Observers now knew this was a space where subtle challenges were tested rigorously. From the gallery, the dynamic was just as compelling. People who had assumed the proceeding was straightforward now recognized the layers at play. Each procedural nuance, each carefully constructed statement, carried weight. Crockett's skill was in balancing engagement with authority. She never over-explained. She never lost calm. But every response carried the message: I am aware, prepared, and in control. Even the authority figures, who had not yet intervened directly, observed the exchange with interest. Subtle nods, slight tilts of the head, a measured shift of weight, all signals that they were evaluating not only the content, but the composure of the speaker under the first true test of pushback. The microhooks here were dual. They engaged the audience, drawing attention to the tension, while also signaling to the room that this was a controlled environment. No sudden reactions, no emotional overflow, just measured navigation of subtle challenge. The first challenge had been met. And yet, everyone knew it was only the beginning. Each question, each interruption, each micro-pause would serve as a building block for the crescendo of scrutiny yet to come. Crockett had demonstrated not only competence, but strategic command. Subtle pushback was absorbed, handled, and transformed into another point of leverage. Silence followed. Not empty silence, but pregnant with anticipation. The audience, the room, even the authority figures all recognized the delicate balance. Challenge, response, control. The next phase was clear. If Section 3 established the weight of authority, Section 4 revealed the first cracks of pressure and the skill required to manage them. The stage was set for escalating scrutiny, and everyone sensed that the real test was approaching. The subtle challenge had passed, but the atmosphere had thickened. There was a collective awareness now. Every word, every pause, every glance carried weight. Crockett sensed it immediately. This was no longer a test of knowledge alone, it was a test of composure under escalating pressure. A new question arrived, sharper this time, crafted with precision. It wasn't aggressive, but it contained implied stakes. Given the discrepancies in the data, how do you justify the conclusions presented? Microhooks littered the question. The word discrepancies hinted at doubt, justify demanded accountability, and the phrase conclusions presented subtly suggested potential oversight. Every observer in the room leaned in slightly. The journalists poised their pens. Even authority figures tilted forward, keenly attuned to the unfolding exchange. Crockett's response was deliberate. She began by acknowledging the concern without conceding the ground. The discrepancies noted are contextually explained by. She layered facts with context, anticipating the follow-up questions before they were voiced. The room responded invisibly. Micro-reactions, a subtle raising of an eyebrow, a slight nod signaled recognition of her expertise and readiness. Her tone was calm, her phrasing precise. The microhooks were now in her delivery. Emphasis on key terms, pauses that highlighted critical points, and controlled pacing that drew attention to her reasoning. As she spoke, another subtle layer of challenge emerged, not in words, but in tone. A question posed with genuine curiosity masked the weight of scrutiny. Can you walk us through your process, step by step? Here, the stakes intensified. Step-by-step explanations could expose inconsistencies or gaps, but Crockett navigated them strategically, providing clarity while reinforcing authority. Each step became a reinforcing micro-hook, guiding the audience to appreciate the rigor of her methodology. The exchange built momentum. Observers noted how she managed tension without defensiveness. The pressure escalated, yet control remained in her hands. The microhooks worked both ways, engaging the audience and subtly signaling her command to the room. By the end of this high-stakes segment, the atmosphere had shifted. The first wave of scrutiny had arrived, testing knowledge, composure, and strategy simultaneously. Crockett had turned potential vulnerability into a demonstration of mastery. Everyone understood. The process was not merely about answering questions, it was about handling pressure, anticipating subtleties and transforming scrutiny into a display of expertise. As the room settled, a silent acknowledgement passed among the observers. Crockett had navigated the first serious wave of challenge, but the real intensity, the full escalation, was yet to come. The stage was set for the next, more intricate phase of engagement. The tension had reached its apex. Crockett, having weathered the initial barrage, now prepared to shift from defense to offense. She recognized the subtle openings, hidden within the questions and statements, the micro-hooks embedded in the scrutiny, and turned them into leverage. "Thank you for highlighting these points," she began, her voice calm yet purposeful, drawing immediate attention. "Let's examine the framework in which these discrepancies arise." Her strategy was deliberate. First, clarify, then contextualize, and finally, pivot to reinforce authority. Each step served as a micro-hook, keeping the audience both in the chamber and beyond engaged. She cited relevant precedents and historical examples, presenting them with precision to preempt counter-arguments. Every reference was chosen to counter the skepticism without confrontation. The room shifted. Justice Barrett's eyes narrowed slightly, signaling recognition that Crockett was not merely responding, she was reframing the narrative. Crockett continued, "Consider the legislative intent behind these provisions. It's not arbitrary. It's informed by historical necessity, constitutional clarity, and equitable standards." Micro-hooks now served dual purposes. They highlighted her mastery of the subject while subtly challenging assumptions. Phrases like "not arbitrary" and "historical necessity" anchored her authority, while constitutional clarity reminded everyone of her legal grounding. Observers in the gallery noticed how she maintained composure under scrutiny, turning each probing question into an opportunity. Conservative commentators, who had anticipated a faltering moment, were visibly recalculating their expectations. Legal analysts scribbled notes furiously, recognizing the subtle rhetorical and procedural mastery on display. The pace of the exchange quickened, yet Crockett controlled it. Each sentence reinforced a broader point. She wasn't simply defending legislation. She was demonstrating why it aligned with constitutional authority and historical precedent. "Let me make this explicit," she continued, lifting a document as evidence. "These communications, thoroughly vetted and verified, illustrate the necessity of consistent national standards to protect the integrity of federal elections." Gasps and murmurs ran through the room as the micro-hook in necessity of consistent national standards resonated with both legal and political observers. She had transformed scrutiny into an opportunity to shape the conversation. The subtle but strategic shift was complete. What began as a test of her knowledge and composure had now become a display of strategic legal mastery. Crockett's rebuttals were precise, evidence-backed, and rhetorically engaging, flipping the initial pressure back onto her challengers. By the end of this segment, it was clear. The narrative had changed. Crockett had seized control of the exchange, demonstrating that preparation, composure, and strategic use of micro-hooks could turn intense scrutiny into an undeniable display of authority. The observers, justices, legal analysts, and reporters alike now recognized that the confrontation was no longer one-sided. Crockett had set the stage for the pivotal next phase, presenting evidence that would leave the court and the nation stunned. With the narrative now under her control, Crockett prepared to deliver the decisive moment, the evidence that would transform skepticism into acknowledgement. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on her. The micro-hooks she had strategically deployed in prior exchanges primed the audience for impact. "Now," she said, her tone deliberate, "let's examine the data itself." She began unfolding the carefully compiled evidence, meticulously verified documents, time-stamped communications, and corroborating testimony that addressed every lingering doubt. The evidence was comprehensive, yet presented with clarity, each piece a micro-hook in its own right, guiding attention to the most critical points. The gallery watched as charts and graphs, illuminated patterns that had been previously obscured in abstract debate. Statements once considered ambiguous were now contextualized. Doubts were replaced with clarity. Crockett emphasized this by repeating key phrases with precision: transparent process, verifiable standards, historically consistent. Each phrase functioned as a micro-hook, reinforcing her authority while keeping attention locked. Justice Barrett leaned forward slightly, signaling engagement. Observers could sense the subtle but unmistakable shift in momentum. Questions that had once carried an air of challenge now seemed almost rhetorical. The evidence itself carried the argument. Crockett's calm, methodical presentation allowed the audience to draw conclusions naturally, without force or confrontation. She paused briefly, letting the weight of the evidence settle. "These records are not merely documents," she said. "They are proof of deliberate, accountable, and lawful action, aligned with both constitutional and legislative mandates." The micro-hook in proof of deliberate, accountable, and lawful action resonated powerfully, reinforcing her credibility. As she concluded, the chamber was silent. The reversal was complete. What began as an intense scrutiny had transformed into validation. The skeptics' initial doubts had been addressed methodically, leaving the court, observers, and media with a clear recognition of her expertise and authority. Analysts in the gallery whispered among themselves, noting how every micro-hook, every strategic pause, and every carefully framed statement had guided the audience to this conclusion. Crockett had turned pressure into performance, skepticism into acknowledgement, and scrutiny into undeniable proof. By the end of this segment, it was evident. The confrontation had reached its climax, with Crockett emerging not only unscathed, but fully vindicated. The evidence had done more than clarify, it had set the stage for a broader discussion of procedural integrity and constitutional responsibility, ensuring that her voice would dominate the narrative beyond the courtroom walls. With the evidence laid bare and the courtroom fully attentive, Crockett shifted seamlessly into her closing statement. Every micro-hook she had previously used now culminated in a powerful, memorable finish. She didn't need dramatics. Her composure, precise wording, and unwavering confidence spoke volumes. "Justices of the Supreme Court," she began, her voice clear and commanding, "today's discussion has not been about politics. It has been about the Constitution, its history, and its intent. Every document I have presented, every precedent I have cited, demonstrates one fundamental truth. Congress possesses the authority to establish federal standards for elections, ensuring every eligible citizen can exercise their right to vote fairly and equally." The chamber remained silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Crockett paused, allowing the statement to resonate. Each pause acted as a micro-hook, giving both the justices and the audience time to absorb the impact. She continued, "This legislation is not a radical departure, nor an overreach. It is a fulfillment of the constitutional duty entrusted to Congress, a duty recognized by the framers, affirmed through history, and essential to protecting the democratic foundation of our nation." As she spoke, reporters scribbled furiously, legal analysts whispered in excitement, and even skeptical justices exchanged thoughtful glances. The clarity and authority of her argument had transformed the room. Crockett concluded with a statement designed to leave a lasting impression. Respect for states' authority, adherence to constitutional text, and protection of voting rights are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary. And it is within this balance that this legislation stands, constitutionally sound and necessary for the American people. As she returned to her seat, the chamber erupted in quiet acknowledgement. Chief Justice Roberts nodded subtly, recognizing the extraordinary nature of her presentation. Justice Barrett's expression, though composed, reflected a begrudging respect. The micro-hooks she had carefully placed throughout her testimony, strategic phrases, evidence, historical context, had guided the court and audience from doubt to recognition. Outside the courtroom, the impact was immediate. Social media exploded with clips of her arguments, News outlets highlighted her precise constitutional reasoning, and legal scholars began updating lectures and commentaries to reflect the unprecedented exchange. Within hours, the phrase Crockett Constitutional Masterclass began trending nationally. Analysts praised her ability to not only defend the legislation, but to educate, engage, and leave a permanent mark on the dialogue surrounding federal election oversight. Weeks later, when the Supreme Court issued its ruling upholding key provisions of the Voting Rights Restoration Act, commentators noted that Crockett's arguments, evidence, and methodical presentation had significantly influenced the court's reasoning. Her voice, preparation, and strategic use of microhooks ensured that her impact would be studied and cited for years to come. In the end, what began as an intense confrontation became a historic demonstration of preparation, constitutional expertise, and unwavering composure. Representative Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her legislation, she had reshaped the conversation about federal authority, voting rights, and the power of meticulous, persuasive argumentation.